The morning sun cast long shadows across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor, as Seaman First Class James Mitchell wiped the sleep from his eyes aboard the USS Arizona. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, and the Hawaiian air carried the scent of plumeria blossoms and salt spray. The fleet lay at anchor like sleeping giants, their steel hulls gleaming in the early light. For most of the 2,500 servicemen stationed at the naval base, this would be just another peaceful Sunday morning in paradise. They had no idea that hundreds of miles to the north, a Japanese strike force was bearing down on them with deadly intent. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered face set in grim determination. The six-carrier strike force had maintained radio silence for 13 days, slicing through the North Pacific under cover of storms and darkness. Behind him, the flight decks bustled with activity as mechanics made final checks on the 353 aircraft that would soon rain death upon the unsuspecting Americans. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was audacious in its scope and devastating in its potential. Operation Z, as it was code-named, represented Japan's desperate gamble to cripple the United States Navy before America could fully mobilize its industrial might. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda climbed into the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber, the lead aircraft of the first wave. At 39 years old, he was one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, handpicked to lead this historic mission. As he strapped himself in, Fukuda thought of his wife and children back in Japan, wondering if he would ever see them again. The weight of the moment pressed upon his shoulders. He was about to lead an attack that would either secure Japan's position in the Pacific or awaken a sleeping giant that would eventually consume his homeland. At Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen was reviewing the morning's reconnaissance reports. The Army Air Forces had been conducting regular patrols, but budget constraints had limited flights to only a few hours each morning. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese forces were moving south toward British and Dutch territories, but few American commanders believed Hawaii itself was under threat. The base was considered too far from Japan and too well defended to be a practical target. This confidence would prove to be tragically misplaced. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg aboard the Arizona was preparing for the morning's routine when his aide brought him coffee and the latest dispatches. The 42-year-old Annapolis graduate had served in the Navy for 22 years, rising through the ranks during peacetime service that had given him little preparation for what was about to unfold. His battleship, commissioned in 1916, was one of the pride of the fleet, her 14-inch guns capable of hurling shells over 20 miles. But on this morning, those mighty weapons would prove useless against an attack from the sky. As reported by the National WWII Museum early on December 7, 1941, citizens and service members alike in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, faced terror as Japanese planes rained fire on the island in a stunning surprise attack. But at 6:30 that morning, all was still peaceful. The harbor's defenders remained unaware that their lives were about to change forever, that they were about to experience what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would later call a date which will live in infamy. At exactly 7:48 in the morning Hawaiian time, Commander Fukuda's voice crackled over the radio with the fateful words Tora, 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 the prearranged signal indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, Pearl Harbor spread out like a detailed model. The mighty Pacific Fleet arranged a perfect formation for target practice. The first wave of 183 aircraft dubbed toward their objectives with mechanical precision, their engines screaming as they plummeted through the morning air. Seaman Mitchell was carrying a tray of coffee to the bridge when the first explosions shattered the peaceful morning. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the harbor. Through the Arizona's porthole, he could see geysers of water erupting around the nearby USS Oklahoma as torpedo bombers from the Japanese carrier Soryu pressed their attack. The water around Battleship Row turned white with foam as massive shells pierced the morning calm. Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge, captain of the destroyer USS Ward, had already engaged a Japanese midget submarine earlier that morning, at 6:45, sinking it with gunfire and depth charges. His report of the encounter had been forwarded to headquarters, but the significance was not immediately recognized. Now, as aircraft with the red rising sun emblazoned on their wings filled the sky above Pearl Harbor, Outerbridge's early morning encounter took on ominous new meaning. The Japanese had indeed been probing American defenses, and their main attack was now underway. The USS Arizona became the primary target of Commander Fukuda's high-level bombers. At 8:06 in the morning, a modified 16-inch naval shell, converted into an armor-piercing bomb, crashed through the battleship's forward magazine. The explosion that followed was apocalyptic in its intensity, lifting the 40-foot boat and hurling debris more than a mile into the air. The blast was so powerful that it registered on seismographs in Honolulu, 30 miles away. In that single, catastrophic moment, 1,177 sailors and Marines died, more than half of all American casualties that day. Captain Van Valkenburg was on the bridge when the bomb struck. The explosion killed him instantly, along with most of his senior officers. Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd, who had been standing beside him, also perished in the blast. Both men would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor for their service. Below decks, Seaman Mitchell found himself trapped in a compartment that was rapidly filling with oil contaminate and water. The lights had gone out, and the ship was listing heavily to port. In the darkness, he could hear the cries of wounded shipmates, echoing through the twisted metal dot at Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor. Army Air Forces personnel scrambled to respond to the surprise attack. Major General Frederick Martin, commanding officer of the Hawaiian Air Force, watched in horror as Japanese fighters strafed his grounded aircraft. Of the 180 Army aircraft stationed in Hawaii, more than half were destroyed or severely damaged in the first 30 minutes of the attack. The few American pilots who managed to get airborne found themselves overwhelmingly outnumbered and outgunned by the experienced Japanese aviators. The attack had achieved everything Admiral Yamamoto had hoped for and more. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese would sink or severely damage 18 American warships, destroy more than 300 aircraft, and kill over 2,400 military personnel and civilians. But even as the bombs fell and the ships burned, the seeds of Japan's ultimate defeat were being sown. The attack, while tactically brilliant, had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, dry docks, and submarine base, infrastructure that would prove crucial to America's eventual Pacific campaign. As the USS Arizona burned with the intensity of a blast furnace, incredible acts of heroism emerged from the chaos and destruction. 19-year-old Seaman First Class Donald Stratton found himself trapped on the forward mast as flames engulfed the ship below him. The heat was so intense that it melted the metal railings he gripped, yet he refused to abandon his post until he could help lower wounded shipmates to safety. His hands burned to the bone. Stratton eventually escaped across a line thrown from the nearby repair ship USS Vestal, but 65 years later, he would still bear the scars of that terrible morning aboard the USS Oklahoma, which had taken multiple torpedo hits and was capsizing to port. Seaman First Class Stephen Young organized rescue efforts for sailors trapped below decks. As the 29,000-ton battleship slowly rolled over, Young repeatedly dove into flooded compartments to pull unconscious men to safety. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Aloysius Schmidt, helped push sailors through portholes to safety even as the rising water reached his chest. Schmidt drowned when the Oklahoma finally settled upside down on the harbor bottom, but his selfless action saved the lives of dozens of his shipmates. Commander Logan Ramsey, operations officer at Ford Island, had the presence of mind to radio the first official alert about the attack. At 7:58 in the morning, his message air raid Pearl Harbor X "This is not" drill flashed across military communication networks, alerting American forces throughout the Pacific that the United States was under attack. Meanwhile, at the Naval Air Station, Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John Finn mounted a machine gun in an exposed position and continued firing at Japanese aircraft despite being wounded multiple times. His sustained fire helped disrupt several bombing runs and earned him the Medal of Honor. The destroyer USS Helm was one of the few American warships to get underway during the attack. Lieutenant Commander Chester Carroll, the ship's captain, ordered his crew to set general quarters and make for the harbor entrance at flank speed. As the Helm raced through the chaos, her gunners engaged Japanese aircraft with every weapon that could be brought to bear. The destroyer managed to escape to open water and began searching for the Japanese submarine force that intelligence reports suggested might be operating nearby. At Wheeler Field, 2nd Lieutenant George Welch and 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor ignored orders to remain in the barracks and raced to nearby Haliwa Airfield. where some P-40 Warhawk fighters had escaped destruction, taking off without authorization. The two pilots engaged Japanese aircraft in aerial combat throughout the morning. Welch shot down 3 enemy planes and Taylor down 2 more, making them among the few American pilots to achieve combat success. During the attack, their unauthorized but heroic actions would later be celebrated in the 1970 Hollywood film Tora, Dr. Mormon Commander, chief medical officer at the Naval Hospital, found himself overwhelmed by the casualties streaming in from the harbor. With most of his staff enjoying Sunday morning leave, Commander pressed every available person into service, including patients who were well enough to help. The hospital's operating rooms rang continuously for 36 hours straight as medical personnel worked desperately to save lives. Many of the wounds they treated were unlike anything they had seen before. Massive burns from burning oil, shrapnel injuries from exploding ammunition, and trauma from the concussive effects of large explosions died as the morning progressed. It became clear that this was not merely a hit-and-run raid, but a carefully planned assault designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. The precision of the Japanese attack, the coordination between different aircraft types, and the detailed intelligence that had obviously been gathered all pointed to months, or even years of preparation. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the lawn of his headquarters watching his ships burn and reportedly said to his staff, "I never thought those little yellow sons of bitches could pull off such an attack. So far from Japan." At 8:54 in the morning, just as American defenders were beginning to organize effective resistance to the first wave of attackers, Lieutenant Commander Shikakazu Shimazaki led 170 additional Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor. This second wave consisted primarily of dive bombers and fighters tasked with finishing off damaged ships and attacking targets that had been missed in the initial assault. However, by now the element of complete surprise was gone, and American anti-aircraft defenses were fully alert and operational. The USS Nevada, though damaged by a torpedo during the first attack, managed to get underway under the command of Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas. As the only battleship moving during the second wave, she became the primary target for Japanese dive bombers who recognized the propaganda value of sinking an American capital ship in the harbor channel. Wave after wave of Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers screamed down at the Nevada, their bombs churning the water around her as she fought her way toward the harbor entrance. Realizing that if the Nevada sank in the channel, it would block the harbor for months, harbor pilot Edgar McFadden and Lieutenant Commander Thomas made the agonizing decision to beach their ship on Hospital Point. As the Nevada's bow touched the muddy bottom, her crew continued to fight back with every operational gun. Seaman Second Class Ross Romano, manned a 5-inch gun mount even after shrapnel wounds left him barely conscious, continuing to fire at attacking aircraft until he collapsed from blood loss. At the submarine base, which had escaped major damage during the first wave, Lieutenant Commander Edward Salamans organized a desperate defense using every available weapon. Submariners, traditionally trained for undersea warfare, found themselves manning anti-aircraft guns and small arms in an effort to protect their boats. The submarines USS Todic and USS Narwhal managed to submerge and escape to open water, where they would later play crucial roles in America's submarine campaign against Japanese shipping. Chief Petty Officer John Finn, despite wounds to both legs and his arm, continued to operate his machine gun from an exposed position throughout both waves of the attack. When his ammunition ran low, other sailors crawled across the fire-swept airfield to bring him fresh belts of .50 caliber rounds. Finn's position became a rallying point for other defenders, and his sustained fire is credited with downing at least one Japanese aircraft and disrupting several others. His actions that day would earn him the first Medal of Honor awarded for the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese pilots of the second wave found their task significantly more difficult than their predecessors. American anti-aircraft fire, practically non-existent during the first attack, now filled the sky with deadly bursts of shrapnel. Several Japanese aircraft were shot down, and many others limped back to their carriers with battle damage. Lieutenant Fusada Ida, whose Zero fighter was hit by ground fire, made the decision to crash his damaged plane into a building at Kaneohe Naval Air Station, rather than attempt to return to his carrier dot as the second wave of attackers departed around 10 in the morning. An eerie quiet settled over Pearl Harbor. The great naval base, which had awakened that morning as a symbol of American power in the Pacific, now resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno. Thick black smoke from burning oil covered the harbor like a funeral shroud, while the twisted wreckage of once mighty warships protruded from the shallow water like the ribs of fallen giants. The USS Arizona continued to burn, and would smolder for 3 more days before the fires finally died out. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, faced a crucial decision as his aircraft returned from the second attack. His staff officers urged him to launch a third wave to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, submarine facilities, and dry docks infrastructure that would be essential to any American recovery effort. However, Nagumo was concerned about American submarines and the possibility that land-based aircraft might have been launched from airfields outside the immediate target area. After much deliberation, he made the fateful decision to withdraw his task force and return to Japan, a choice that would later be criticized as the attack's greatest strategic error. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Pearl Harbor resembled a maritime graveyard. The battleship USS Arizona rested on the harbor bottom, her superstructure barely visible above the oil-slicked water. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors in her inverted hull. Rescue crews worked frantically with cutting torches and pneumatic drills, racing against time to free men who were still alive in air pockets within the overturned ship. Over the next 16 days, 32 sailors would be rescued from the Oklahoma's hull, though sadly many more would perish before they could be reached. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack. While having lunch at the White House, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called at 1:37 in the afternoon Washington time with the stunning news that Pearl Harbor was under attack. Roosevelt's first reaction was reportedly one of disbelief, but as additional reports confirmed the scope of the disaster, the president began preparing for what he knew would be America's entry into World War II. That evening, he began drafting the speech that would ask Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. The rescue and recovery efforts at Pearl Harbor became a testament to American resilience and determination. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the Arizona's damage control officer, organized firefighting efforts despite being wounded by shrapnel. Working alongside civilian yard workers who had volunteered to help, his teams fought the massive fires that threatened to spread to nearby ships and fuel storage facilities. The temperature of the burning oil was so intense that it melted the aluminum superstructure and warped the steel decking of the Arizona. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, found his career effectively ended by the surprise attack, despite evidence that Washington had failed to provide adequate intelligence warnings. Kimmel and Army General Walter Short would bear much of the blame for the disaster. Within days, both men would be relieved of their commands and face congressional investigations that would continue for years. The question of responsibility for Pearl Harbor would become one of the most contentious issues in American military history. In Japan, news of the attack's success was greeted with jubilation. Emperor Hirohito, who had privately expressed reservations about war with America, issued a rescript declaring that the United States and Britain had disturbed the peace of East Asia. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor plan, was more circumspect in his reaction. He reportedly told subordinates that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve, though historians now question whether he actually spoke these prescient words. The human cost of the attack was staggering. 2,403 Americans died, including 68 civilians. Another 1,178 were wounded. The Navy lost 1,177 killed. The Army lost 233. The Marine Corps lost 109, and 68 civilians perished. Among the dead were men from every state in the Union and representing dozens of ethnic backgrounds, a cross-section of American society that would be reflected in the massive military mobilization that followed. As reported by the Library of Congress, on December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii territory, killing more than 2,300 Americans. But beyond the immediate casualties, the attack fundamentally changed American attitudes toward the war. Isolationist sentiment, which had been strong throughout the 1930s, evaporated almost overnight. Americans who had opposed involvement in what they saw as a European conflict now demanded vengeance against Japan and its Axis partners. The strategic implications of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate damage to the Pacific Fleet. Japan had succeeded in eliminating American battleship strength in the Pacific, but had failed to destroy the aircraft carriers that would prove to be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea during the attack and escaped unharmed. These carriers, along with their experienced flight crews, would form the nucleus of America's Pacific offensive that would ultimately lead to Japan's defeat. The weeks following Pearl Harbor saw an unprecedented mobilization of American resources and determination. Salvage operations began immediately, with Navy divers and civilian contractors working around the clock to assess damage and begin recovery efforts. The USS Nevada, which had been beached during the attack, was refloated within months and eventually returned to service. The capsized USS Oklahoma proved more challenging, requiring a massive effort involving winches, cables, and careful engineering to right the 20-9-1000-ton hull. Commander Edward Ellsberg, known as the Navy's premier salvage expert, arrived at Pearl Harbor within days of the attack to oversee recovery operations. Under his direction, teams of divers descended into the dark, oil-filled compartments of sunken ships to recover bodies and assess damage. The work was dangerous and psychologically devastating, as divers often found themselves working alongside the remains of sailors who had died at their posts. Yet the recovery effort continued with grim determination, driven by the knowledge that every ship returned to service brought America closer to victory. On December 8th, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war. His famous Day of Infamy speech, delivered with characteristic Roosevelt eloquence, galvanized American public opinion like no other address in the nation's history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan, Roosevelt declared. The speech lasted only 6 minutes, but its impact would resonate for generations. The declaration of war passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 388 to 1, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana voting against it. The Senate vote was unanimous. Within hours, America was officially at war not just with Japan, but with Germany and Italy as well. After Adolf Hitler honored his treaty obligations and declared war on the United States, the global conflict that had been raging since 1939 now truly encompassed the world. Industrial mobilization began immediately, as American factories converted from civilian to military production with stunning speed. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant began producing B-24 Liberator bombers at the rate of 1 per hour. Shipyards from Maine to California worked around the clock building Liberty ships, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. By war's end, American industry would produce more military equipment than all other combatant nations combined, fulfilling Roosevelt's promise to make America the arsenal of democracy. The attack also prompted a dark chapter in American history with the internment of Japanese Americans. Driven by wartime hysteria and long-standing racial prejudice, Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced relocation of more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast to detention camps inland. This violation of civil liberties would later be recognized as one of the most shameful episodes in American history, leading to formal government apologies and reparations payments decades later. For the survivors of Pearl Harbor, the recovery process was both physical and emotional. Many sailors and Marines suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such psychological support was largely unavailable in 1941. Men like Seaman Donald Stratton spent months in hospitals, recovering from severe burns, while others carried invisible wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Yet many Pearl Harbor survivors went on to distinguished military careers, driven by a desire to honor their fallen comrades and ensure that America would never again be caught unprepared. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military impact. Japan's attack had succeeded in bringing the United States into the war, but it had also united the American people behind a common cause in a way that no amount of political rhetoric could have achieved. The isolationist movement collapsed overnight, replaced by a national determination to defeat the Axis powers regardless of cost. Admiral Yamamoto's fears about awakening the sleeping giant were proving prophetic. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked not just America's entry into World War II, but the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. Within 6 months, the tactical advantage gained at Pearl Harbor had been squandered at the Battle of Midway, where for Japanese aircraft carriers, including the Akagi and Soryu, that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, were sunk by American naval aviators. The industrial capacity that Japan had hoped to cripple was instead mobilized on an unprecedented scale, producing the weapons and equipment that would ultimately overwhelm Japanese forces. Throughout the Pacific, the human stories of Pearl Harbor continued long after December 7, 1941. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, who had escaped across a line from the burning Arizona, spent months recovering from burns that covered 6 to 5% of his body. He eventually returned to active duty and served aboard a destroyer in the Pacific, participating in the battles of the Philippine Sea and Light Gulf. His memoir, written 75 years after Pearl Harbor, would become a bestseller and inspire a new generation to remember the sacrifice of that generation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would not live to see Japan's defeat. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his aircraft over the Solomon Islands in a mission codenamed Operation Vengeance. Yamamoto's death was seen as fitting retribution for Pearl Harbor, though by then the strategic initiative in the Pacific had long since passed to American forces. His prediction that Japan could only fight successfully for 6 months to a year proved remarkably accurate. The physical scars of Pearl Harbor healed slowly but steadily. By 1944, Pearl Harbor had been rebuilt into the most formidable naval base in the Pacific, serving as the launching point for the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces to the very shores of Japan. The harbor that had been a scene of destruction and defeat became the symbol of American resurgence and determination. Dry docks that had been damaged in the attack were repaired and enlarged to service the new classes of aircraft carriers and battleships that rolled off American production lines. The USS Arizona, too badly damaged to be salvaged, became a war grave and eventually a national memorial. In 1962, a memorial structure was built over the sunken battleship, allowing visitors to pay their respects to the 1,177 sailors and Marines who remain entombed within her hull. The memorial draws more than 1 million visitors annually, serving as a reminder of the price of unpreparedness and the resilience of the American spirit. For the Japanese participants in the attack, the victory at Pearl Harbor proved to be Pyrrhic. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda survived the war and later became a Christian evangelist, traveling to the United States to speak about reconciliation and peace. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, died by suicide on Saipan in 1944 as American forces overran the island. Many of the pilots who had achieved such success on December 7th would perish in the grinding battles of attrition that followed. The strategic lessons of Pearl Harbor influenced American military thinking for generations. Never again would the United States allow itself to be caught so completely unprepared for attack. The development of sophisticated intelligence networks, early warning systems, and rapid response capabilities all trace their origins to the failures exposed on December 7, 1941. The attack demonstrated both the vulnerability of fixed installations to surprise attack and the importance of maintaining constant vigilance in an uncertain world. Today, Pearl Harbor stands as more than just a memorial to those who died on December 7, 1941. It represents a turning point not just in American history, but in world history. The attack that was intended to cripple American naval power instead awakened the industrial and military might that would reshape the global order. From the flames and wreckage of that Sunday morning in Hawaii emerged the superpower that would dominate world affairs for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The day that lived in infamy had indeed changed World War II forever, though not in the way Admiral Yamamoto and his colleagues had intended. In striking at Pearl Harbor, Japan had not merely attacked a naval base. It had awakened a sleeping giant whose response would echo through history.